Hello and welcome to UCL's Lunch Hour Lectures. My name is Uta Steiger. I'm from the European Institute here at UCL, and it's my great pleasure to be introducing today the two speakers. Both of them are economists at UCL, and both of them are from the Center for Research and Analysis of Migration. Christian Dustmann here is the founding director of the Center for Research and Analysis of Migration. He's a labor economist and with a special interest in questions of migration, education, inequality, crime, and the labor market more generally speaking. He is a fellow of the British Academy and the current president of the European Society of Labour Economists, as well as a member of several other academies of sciences in Europe. But speaking today first will be Ian Preston, also, as I said, an economist. His research deals mainly with questions of consumer behavior, the distribution of income, and migration, as well as public and tax issues. He is also a fellow of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And today they're going to be talking to the rather topical subject of free movement and economic gains in that area. Passing on to them.
Thanks. Yeah, so as Uta says, this is highly topical issue. UK, as everyone knows, is about to take political decisions of enormous import for the economic future of the country, Brexit as a whole, but also the manner of Brexit, withdrawal from the single market, all motivated ultimately, arguably, by wanting to end participation in in free movement within the EU. Government's announced announced its intention to change migration policy after Brexit in such a way that will restrict migration to concentrate on highly skilled migration, which of course in practice means highly paid migration. Popular discussion tends to paint a rather negative picture of economic migration that tends to draw a contrast between economic migrants and more deserving types of migrants, particularly refugees. And yet, thinking of this as an economist, very little of this makes sense. This is not the way that economists tend to think about migration. Migration really has many positive aspects which don't really make it into public discussion. And free movement, removal of barriers to migration has many positive aspects to it. It's good for productive efficiency, in that it allows workers to move from places where their labour is less valuable to where it's more valuable. It enhances global fairness because the gains from migration tend to go to people who begin poorer rather than begin richer. It also has insurance benefits. If we have economic fluctuations which differ in different countries, then the possibility of labour moving between those countries can smooth out economic fluctuations. They'll tend to move from countries that are in recessions to countries that are temporarily more prosperous. That will tend to smooth out those fluctuations. Again, that's beneficial. There's evidence that it's good for innovation. It allows people to move, people who have innovation to move to where they can develop them. Ideas get spread around by migration. All of these things are economically good things. And I'm going to concentrate really on the first two of those in what I'm going to say for the next 10 minutes or so. It's striking that there's a difference in the way that people look at migration when they're thinking about migration within countries and between countries. I mean, it's true both if you're looking across countries and within countries that where people are born determines their opportunities, determines their economic prosperity across their life cycle. But the possibility of people being able to move allows them to move to where they're economically more valued. And within countries, we just think of this as a natural thing. It'd be crazy to suggest restricting migration, say, from Birmingham to London because of impact that it might have on workers in London or something like that. Yet when the migration goes across borders between countries, attitudes seem to change completely, and it becomes highly politically controversial. I want to think a little through what we're going to talk about why that might be the case, and whether it's a good thing that it's more politically controversial in that context. We can look back at some views from history of economics. Adam Smith had something to say on free movement of labour. He looked at policies of his day which restricted movement within countries in that time, restricted movement within country. And see the quote here is clearly pointing to the fact it's a bad thing. It leads to very inconvenient inequality in the advantages and disadvantages of employment in different places. And people who look at this more recently have suggested at a global level, this could be one of the biggest sources of economic efficiency in the global economy as a whole. Particularly, we have this quote here from Clemens where he says barriers to emigration put one of the fattest of all wedges between humankind's current welfare and its potential welfare. And I'll try and point out why that might be, why that might be the case and what the evidence might be behind that. How big are these gains? Well, there's a large growing literature in economics which attempts to quantify the magnitude of these potential gains at a global level. And more or less the universal conclusion from this, whether you're looking actually at the world as a whole, the possibility of open borders in the entire world, or you're just looking at free movement in smaller areas like free movement within the EU, the conclusion is generally pretty well universal that it's beneficial, not just beneficial, but potentially that there are enormous economic gains that could be enjoyed through greater liberalization. And yet, governments within the countries, the receiving countries for migration, tend to persist with restrictions, and those are widely supported. And we want to think about why that might be so. So why is it unpopular? Well, it could be to do with the economics, and what I'm going to talk about for the rest of what I say to you is about the economics of the economic effects of free mobility, and we'll end up concluding that really, even though there might be some losers and some gainers, still overall the effects of free mobility are a good thing. Or it might be that it's not to do with economics at all. And I'll hand over about halfway through the talk to Christian, who'll start to talk about that and to talk about what might be driving hostility to immigration and the extent to which it's to do with cultural fears about social change and so on, rather than actually about economic effects. So some diagrams just to illustrate the argument for why migration might be a good thing. So what I've drawn for you here, there's two diagrams. We think of two countries, country A and country B. So country A is on the right over here, country B over there. You can think of country A being the richer country, the country where workers enjoy higher wages. Country B would be the poorer one. We're going to get, so this is going to be the source country for the migration. Migrants are going to move, we're going to look at migrants moving from B to A and what the effects are. What's on this diagram here, on both of these diagrams here, what we've got along the bottom is number of workers, and what we've got going up the vertical axis is the wage that they're paid, okay? And the curves that we've drawn on there, for B going from left to right, it tells you the value of an additional worker, the economic value of an additional worker to firms in B. And on this one here, reading the opposite way, reading from right to left, you've got the value of an additional worker in A. So this is the amount that firms will be willing to pay workers. In country B here, the red line at the bottom here tells you the total workforce. Okay, so that's L0B. Read up from there to the line, you find what workers will be paid in country B, and we read across, and it's the wage that's marked on there. In country A, a smaller labour force, read up to the curve, and they're paid WA0, which is higher. This is a nice diagram to use to illustrate the effects of migration on different people in the different countries, because we can shade the area in underneath these two curves, and if we take the areas underneath the curves going from 0 to the total number of people working in that country, we add up the value of all of the workers, and we get the total value of the output in those countries. Okay, so that's the total value of output in country A, that's in country B. But we can also see how that output is split up between different inputs to production, to workers and to other inputs, particularly capital, because the areas that are shaded, that are more darkly shaded, tell you the total amount that goes to labor in the two countries. So remember, the horizontal distance at the bottom here is the labor force in A. The vertical, the height of that darker shaded block is the wage they're paid. So the total block is the wage times number of workers. So that's the total amount paid to workers in country A. And over here, the darker shaded block is the amount paid to workers in country B. And given the total area under the curves is the total value of output, and under reasonable assumptions, that will be split between the different inputs in the two countries, the rest of that value of the output will go to capital. Okay? So we get a nice split on the diagram of the amount paid to labor in A and the amount paid to capital, and over here the amount paid to labor in B and the amount paid to capital. Right. Now what happens if we, how can we analyze migration on this diagram? Okay. And at this point, you see why I've drawn these curves going in opposite directions, one from left to right and one from right to left. Because if we bring them together such that they meet at the value of the labor force in the two countries, then the total distance along the bottom is going to add up to the total global labor force. Okay? And the point where we divide between country B and country A tells you the split of the workforce between the two countries. And we can then think about the possibility of workers moving from the one country to the other. And which way they're going to move? Well, obviously, they're going to move from where they're paid less to where they're paid more. Okay. So that big red arrow is in the opposite direction to the flow of workers. Workers are flowing from B to A, but that means that the number of workers in country A expands, which is why the arrow is going that way. Okay. So we move from having been there to having been over there, to being over there. And we can see that makes a change in the wages in the two countries. Okay, the wage in country A, we move down the blue line to a new lower wage in country A, and we move back up the red line in B to a higher wage in country B. Remember, that was the distribution of output before we had the change. Okay, so the sum of those two blocks that have been shaded in is the total value of output in the global economy. What happens after the change? It changes to there. So now shading in the areas underneath the two curves, we get that picture to illustrate the total value of output. What's happened? We've got an overall gain. The yellow area that's been shaded in there is the growth in the total value of output in the world. And that's happened because workers have moved from where they're less valued, country B, to where they're more valued, country A. But also behind that, there's some redistribution. Because in country A, the wage has changed. Okay? The wage has fallen in country A as a result of the inflow of workers. That's reduced payments to labor, but it's also increased payments to capital. So there's redistribution from labor to capital in country A. There's redistribution the other way in country B, from capital to labor. And migrants, they're the people who are in the area here, who've moved from the one country to the other, they've clearly gained, okay, because they've moved for the very purpose of increasing their wages. Add all these up and think about them. There are various other areas we have to think about. If you add all it up, you end up with the total gain that I talked about earlier. But as we can see, that gain is masking a complicated picture of redistribution. Wages have fallen in the one country. They've gone up in the other country. So there's been redistribution from labor to capital and capital to labor, depending what country you're in. And the biggest gains have probably gone to migrants. What about the distributional aspect to this? Are the pattern of gains at the level of the global economy progressive or not? Have they gone to poorer workers? Well, they have tended to go to people who began with the lowest wages. So if we care about global inequality, then looking at global output gains alone is going to understate the global gain from free movement. So if we're concerned about inequality, the argument for having free movement is even stronger. Now, can we quantify these gains? Well, simulations using the simplest models. Skip there. Slide's gone missing somewhere there. Okay, if we try to simulate the simplest sort of models that might underlie this, where the difference in the values of labour in the different countries are to do with differences in the stocks of labour and capital in the two countries, and possibly also differences in the technology that's used in the different country, differences in working practices, then we can get enormous gains, enormous estimates of gains. Going back to the 1980s, the first people that looked at this, called Hamilton and Wally, they did an estimate of the global gains at the level of the world economy. We suggested it's good as much as double world output, or even more, if we allowed free movement from countries where workers are paid less to where they're paid more. Enormous distributional effects as well involved in this. It involved wages in the most developing regions falling by up to a half, but in the less developed parts of the country, wages increasing more than tenfold as a consequence of the sort of movements that might be involved, but also enormous flows. Sort of, around half the world economy, half the workers in the world economy moving as a consequence of in these sort of simulations. Okay, these figures are very striking, but they rely on reforms which take the economy very, very far away from what we actually experience. So they're possibly unreliable at that level, but also the models are slightly unsubtle. So more recent work tries to be a bit more realistic in things that are neglected in the simple sort of story I told you on those diagrams, tries to recognize that labor is not homogeneous, it differs in skills, there are more and less skilled workers. It may be that certain types of workers are more likely to migrate, skilled labor in particular may be more likely to migrate. That may not be beneficial to everyone that's in the country they've migrated from. It might raise the wages of skilled labor in the country they've come from, but it might harm unskilled labor who are no longer working with as many skilled workers. These are concerns about what's sometimes called brain drain. We also can ask questions about whether skills are going to be transferable between countries when migrants go from poorer countries to richer ones. Can they apply their skills easily in the economies they go to? Well, what we observe in practice, if we look at what happens to actual migrants, is skilled migrants don't tend to work in the countries they move to, at least in early years, in jobs that match up to their skills. They tend to work in rather lower skilled jobs, so they may be competing with unskilled workers in the countries they go to. We can try and build that into our models. We can also think about trade. It may be that, particularly if there are non-traded sectors in the economy that workers are moving to, they expand the size of the economy they're moving to, and that can have benefits for the receiving country. Recent work has suggested that that's really probably very important. Remittances, income may be sent back from migrants to the countries they've come from. That also seems to be important in recent work. And we can also think about interaction with the public sector as well. Different tax systems and public spending policies in different countries may provide incentives for migration that have nothing to do with productive efficiency and are therefore actually not so clearly a good thing. Okay? Build all these things in and try to quantify the gains. In the most recent models, they still suggest very large global output gains. It suggests the market size effects that I just talked about are probably very large, and they mean that receiving countries probably gain as well as the sending countries. Okay, so the conclusion you might have drawn from the diagram I did earlier is possibly misleading because the gains to the receiving country may actually be much bigger. Remittances are also important and they magnify the benefits to origin countries. And an important point, most of the gains come from unskilled migration. So just to end my bit, the overall conclusion, differences in labour productivity in different places create very large potential gains from labour mobility at an international level. Biggest gains go to citizens of origin countries, especially, of course, to the migrants. But citizens of destination countries probably also gain if we look at the most recent work people have done on this. But the people who gain most clearly, people in the origin countries, are not the people whose votes matter to deciding the openness of the countries they're thinking of moving to. And it may be that labour market competition or fears of it in the receiving countries could be a reason why people in those countries are against migration. Or it could be to do with other things. That's the point where I hand over to Christian.
So very simply, economic models suggest that there are large gains from migration. They also suggest, however, that there are distributional effects. Not everybody wins. There are some people who lose. And it also suggests what Ian pointed out at the end, that those who are the biggest winners are usually not those who make the political decisions. So that is one explanation as to why we see an increasingly restrictive attitude, particularly in the Western world, towards immigration. However, there may be other reasons, and some of them Ian pointed out a little bit earlier. So the principal objections to free mobility may actually not be economic. And about 15 or 18 years ago, time moves very fast, when I came to London, I was discussing these issues a lot with Ian, and we thought, well, there is so much economic reason why migration actually could be a good thing. However, what we see in the way policies are designed, this seems to be contrary to what economists would actually expect policies to be. And that may well be because economics is not really what is on the mind of people when they think about migration and when they think about what should be an optimal migration policy. So we started working on data from the British Attitude Survey, trying to understand whether we can actually separate the different factors that impact on the way individuals form their views about migration. And we then extended that work by having the opportunity to create a module for the first European Social Survey, where we asked 60 questions which were aimed at doing exactly the analysis I will be talking about now. So what the hypothesis was in that work is that attitudes to immigration reflect a combination of concerns which are determined by socio-cultural factors, by economic factors, and a mixture of the two. So the question we were asking in that work and in the first paper is, what is the relative importance of multicultural or socio-cultural factors in determining views about immigration policy and economic concerns of the sort which may influence people because of the distributional effects Ian was just pointing out here. And the key finding of that work is actually that socio-cultural factors are far more important than concerns over the impact of migration on employment, wages and taxes, actually by factor 3 to 5. And these results are very stable. You can change the way we extract these factors from the data. You can do all types of robustness checks. You can use different data sets, which we have done as well. Nevertheless, there is also, and there's always a dominance of socio-cultural factors in determining the views individuals have about migration over economic factors. To just show you some of that work, well, let me first start with a regularity we have in all these data sets. One regularity is that there is a very strong gradient of individuals' views about migration with respect to education and with respect to age. So what we have in this diagram here is the sentiment for more migration for highly educated young people. We have four groups: highly educated young, highly educated older, should be careful with old, low educated young, and low educated older individuals. So sentiment for more migration of highly educated young, and each dot here represents one country. So this is country averages, is on the horizontal axis. Sentiment for immigration for any of the other groups on the vertical axis. So when we put on the vertical axis sentiment for more migration, high educated young, we will be on this 45-degree line. So that means any other group which lies below the 45-degree line has a less favorable attitude towards more liberal migration policies. And what you see from this simple diagram is that relative to young educated individuals, highly educated older individuals have slightly less liberal views about migration policy. The red dots are low educated young individuals, again slightly less favorable views about migration policies that are more liberal, and the least liberal group are individuals who are older and low educated. You find that basically in any attitudinal data set, and I'm coming back to that a little bit later. So one reason for that could be, for instance, it is economic concerns which create this gradient. Another reason is it could be socio-economic, socio-cultural concerns, and let me come back to that later. So what we did in this work is we try to kind of split up the support for liberal migration policies into economic concerns and social-cultural concerns. I don't have time to tell you exactly how we did that. I will just give you the key findings. And the key findings are that, well, if you look at the attitudes towards more or less migration, more or less liberal migration policies, there is very clearly a very large difference between the effect of economic concerns and the effect of social-cultural concerns. So this is what I pointed out earlier, the factor of 3 to 5 in terms of difference. We can do that with a set of other questions. Here is the question I just more or less, my attitudes towards more or less migration, more or less liberal migration policies. Here is whether immigration is good or bad for the economy, and here whether migration makes the country a better or worse place to live. Again, this is the impact of economic concerns on views about each of these 3 factors. If we look at the effect of social-cultural concerns, except for whether immigration is good or bad for the economy, where clearly economic factors will have to matter. For all the other responses, it is social-cultural concerns which are far more important. We also asked the question, well, there is a big gap between tertiary and primary educated individuals. And the gap is about 13 percentage points in terms of difference between be more or less liberal about immigration policies. Lower educated individuals are less liberal in their attitudes about liberal migration policies. The question we ask then is, well, is this gap actually driven by economic concerns? Because older, less educated individuals may feel they are more vulnerable economically when migration happens, or is it driven by socio-cultural factors? And we do this composition, again, this gap is strongly determined by social-cultural factors, and far less so by economic concerns. That, of course, politically is very important. So we can convince people, or we can discuss with people the economic consequences of migration. It is far less easy for politicians to take any kind of line on those socio-economic, social-cultural factors, which is, do you want your country to be more homogeneous with respect to language, with respect to religion? Do you mind if people of other ethnicity are living in your neighborhood, etc., then to influence views on how economic factors impact on their economic livelihood. Now, that is what I have just shown you is basically the same in every country. We have data on the vertical axis, again, socio-cultural concerns, here economic concerns. This is the 45-degree line, so that would mean that both factors are equally important. And what we see here is that for every country, these are European countries, except for this one here, which is, I think, Luxembourg, the social-cultural concern is more important to form views about liberal migration policy than the economic concern. And that is actually the same for migrants and non-migrants in the same country. So here we have immigrants and here we have natives. Again, for immigrants, foreign-born individuals in a particular country, if it comes to views about more or less liberal migration policy, the social-cultural concern is clearly dominant. Now, that clearly is one reason why politics about migration are very challenging. So whenever we want to rationalize political decisions, if we do it in a domain where rationalization becomes very murky because we don't understand the formation or the way individuals form their views about a particular issue, politics become very clearly a challenge. And migration and migration policies is certainly one such issue. Now, the next thing, which is of course important and has become very important in recent years, is not just the economic potential benefit or potential costs of migration, but the very clear political price political parties are paying these days when they favor more liberal migration policies. We have seen a rise of populist parties in basically every European country, and they are all feeding on one particular issue, and that is migration. We have tried to understand better, the extent and the magnitude of the impact of migration on such attitudes in work for Denmark. Now, there we ask the question, how does the voting behavior of individuals change if we allocate refugees to the particular municipality where they are living? Now, that's a thought experiment, and it's very hard to kind of do that in reality because immigrants or refugees are not really allocated. And if they are not allocated, they may go to areas where people actually like them more. So any kind of causal analysis or causal conclusion from a study which looks at voting outcomes in relation to the allocation of immigrants or where immigrants go would not be causal. However, there has been what we call policy experiment in Denmark in the 80s and 90s, where refugees who were granted asylum were quasi-randomly allocated to different municipalities. What we are doing here is we follow that for about 12 years, and we try to understand how the allocation of immigrant or refugee groups to different areas affects the voting behavior for political parties. And again, let me just give you, the main conclusions of that work. Over the period we consider, allocated refugees presented about 1% of the total population, or allocated refugees cumulated to about 1% of the population. And this is kind of the main graph here. I here categorize the political spectrum in 4 different groups: center-left, center-small, center-right, and anti-immigrant. And the anti-immigrant party is the DPP, a party which is now in parliament, which actually started to rise in the 1980s. And the way you should read these numbers is that a 1% increase in the number of refugees allocated to a particular area between 2 electoral cycles increases the vote share of the far-right anti-immigrant party by about 1.23 percentage points. That is very large because that party at that time had only about 5 to 6% of the total vote share. So a dramatic increase in the relative vote share of that particular party. Well, somebody has to lose votes, and that happens mainly on the left side of the political spectrum. Now let me just go a little bit further. And one remarkable thing from that work, which we absolutely didn't expect, is the different responses of individuals to an allocation of refugees in urban and in rural areas. So urban areas are the 5% largest cities in Denmark. Rural areas is the entire residual, all the other cities. And what we see actually is that this strong response in terms of vote share increases for right-wing parties is actually only driven by rural areas. It doesn't happen in the urban areas. Rather, it happens going in the opposite direction. What was also remarkable was when we basically take all the rural communities, and we try to understand whether, for instance, in a community which suffered high unemployment in the past, the same increase in refugee population leads to a larger or lower increase in the vote share for right-wing parties, we see dramatic heterogeneity. For instance, the larger the share, the effect of an increase in the refugee share on anti-immigrant parties is the larger the share of previous immigrants, the higher pre-policy crime, the higher the share of more affluent individuals, the lower the share of individuals who pay church taxes as a measure of altruism, the higher the welfare dependency rates of existing immigrant populations. So large heterogeneity. So in terms of the political price you have to pay for allocating individuals to different areas, that political price differs across areas. So that is making doubtful the European policy of having quotas for different countries. It may not be the best policy. So let me conclude. There were potentially, as Ian pointed out, huge gains from liberalizing migration policies. However, there are winners and losers, and in particular those who gain most have usually the least political influence on such migration policies. Views on migration policies are strongly influenced by non-economic concerns, as I pointed out a little bit earlier. The loss in efficiency gains through restrictive migration policies may be actually seen as the price voters are willing to pay for addressing non-economic concerns in the way policies towards migration are designed in different countries. Immigration is likely to support populist movements and political radicalization, which adds an important political price. And I think the activity we see on European level in terms of, coordinating migration policies, exactly in particular towards the southern Mediterranean, is very much driven by the very high political costs centrist parties feel they have to pay if they don't do so. Immigration policy walks, therefore, a very thin rope between exploiting the economic benefits, which are clearly there, and addressing the concerns of voters. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristen and Ian, for such a clearly articulated approach to a very complex issue. We have about 7 or 8 minutes for questions. So if you'd like to ask one, could you please raise your hand and wait for a mic to come to you? There's one right here in the front, please.
Thank you. I do agree that freedom of movement, migration is a big contribution to, especially to a liberal economy. But in my opinion, shouldn't migration be also a matter of quality over quantity? Because if you look at the Mediterranean refugees, boat refugees, many of refugees now, they receive a significant amount of welfare from the respective government that they refuge to, but they aren't significantly competitive in contributing to the economy of where they are migrating. So should there be a stricter law and order on migration in general, because we were concerned about quality over quantities? Thank you.
I'm going to pass this on straight to you, just to make sure that the mic has been sorted out.
Yeah, so, I mean, we are not here to say something about migration policy. We are just presenting, the basis for why many economists, or how economists think about migration. We are trying to present some findings on, why economic concerns are not the only thing which actually moves people when they think about migration, actually maybe a minor factor, and talking about the political consequences. Now, from an economic viewpoint, whether migration should be low-skilled or high-skilled has to do what the economy actually needs. So if you think about what Ian earlier said, if you look at the global welfare, if we redistribute, or if you give very poor individuals, which are usually unskilled, the opportunity to earn higher wages, you increase world welfare by more than redistributing to individuals who are better skilled. So that's the economic answer. But then, of course, from the viewpoint of the destination country, that may not necessarily be the right policy, because they may need more skilled migrants, or even, more unskilled migrants. We don't know. So that depends on the particular situation. In the 50s and 60s, migration to Europe was unskilled, because that's what industries needed. If we look at the agricultural sector, that's a sector where migration is crucial to be competitive on global level. And again, we are talking about unskilled migration. We look at university sector, at people who are working at UCL and at the academic sector, clearly skilled people are needed. So to think about migration policy being only good if it's only selective on skilled migrants from an economic viewpoint makes not much sense.
Thank you. I'm going to take 2 questions, both of them over here. The gentleman here and to the back.
I have a question about the economic model presented regarding the net effects on the country that is the source of migrants. So is there some, how would you say the model shows the net effect on the country, taking into account brain drain? So in which instances would the net effect be positive and in which negative?
Well, I mean, workers leaving the origin country would mean there are fewer workers there, and that would tend to raise wages in the country they've come from. But if you do differentiate between more and less skilled workers in the origin countries, and if the outflow is the more skilled, then, as I said, there could be a brain drain effect. That could be unhelpful to less skilled workers who are left behind in the origin countries. But there are things that go against that. There are, for example, remittances. Remittance flows back from the people who've left can be a very important positive to the country, to the origin country. Workers, I mean, there was no time dimension in the model that I talked through. In fact, a lot of migration may be temporary, and people will go back and they'll take back skills, they'll take back things that they've learned. That also is beneficial to the origin country. So I think overall, it's not at all clear that whether, even if we do have a model in which brain drain effects are possible, that is actually what we find. I think some of the work on brain drain effects on less developed countries suggests that actually it's nothing like as harmful as you might worry about.
Your second bullet point there makes me feel there's something I've misunderstood, because it says those who gain the most have the least political influence. But in the first talk, we saw that in the receiving country, there's a lowering of wages and an increase of capital. And nobody would think that the holders of capital don't have political influence. And they can typically buy a terrific amount of political influence. So I think I've misunderstood something. Can you help me?
The biggest gainers are the migrants. They're the people who we're thinking of as having the least political influence. I mean, they often don't even have the vote in the place that they've gone to. So I mean, that's the sense in which the people with the most to gain, and also people in the origin countries, typically in those simple models that I talked about earlier, are also gainers. They also have no input into the decisions in the destination countries. So that was the point being made there. Obviously, there are a lot of actors. There are a lot of different people who are affected in a complex ways in the pictures that we, as you saw in those pictures that we did there. But it's by no means clear that the people who have most interest in liberal migration policies are the most influential.
Thank you. I'm afraid we only have time for one more question, so I'm going to just take the lady over there.
Mine's quite a fast one. Regarding the data you said when the people from older ages and lower education are more opposed to immigration, do those results still stand if you were to take the lower educated individuals in less economically developed countries? So for your data set, was it used for developed countries and developing countries, or was it mostly
no, this was European data. Now that's a good question, and actually I don't know the answer to that. I'm not aware of surveys which, and there may be surveys, and that would be quite interesting. However, lower developed countries are usually not immigration countries; they are concerned about emigration, and of course, any views about liberal immigration policies from the viewpoint of an emigration country is speaking to very different population groups. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm delighted to see there was so much interest, really testament to your research and the way you've presented this. I'm very sorry I have to cut this off at this point, but will you please join me in thanking both speakers?